Welcome back to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. Privileged to have you here. If you're joining us for the first time, please note we are the UK's largest pro-marriage organisation. We represent individuals and groups, tens of thousands of them from all faiths and none, who support and promote this thing, one man, one woman marriage, recognising, of course, other things take place in a liberal democracy, but none of those are man-woman marriage. And because of its unique, special, valuable contribution, we believe it should be recognised, promoted, and aspired to as the thing which brings about the best version of the next generation, as all the evidence clearly suggests it does. Now, some people who disagree with me on that have said I should go and talk to a psychiatrist. You're going to be pleased, because today I'm doing just that. It's a privilege to welcome Dr. Nick Land, an eminent psychiatrist with expertise in many different areas, including this thing, expressive individualism. And we'll be talking to Nick about what that means. We'll be talking to Nick about porn, the psychological effects thereof, about why monogamy in a marriage is such a useful psychological thing, why adultery is so damaging to a relationship, and lots of other connected issues. Nick, it's a privilege to have you with us. Would you like to say hello to our listeners and our viewers?
Greetings. It's great to be with you, Tony.
It's great to have you. Now, Nick, I mentioned expressive individualism as a context, and we're going to lead on from that, hopefully, to discuss other things about things like the importance of sexuality in a marriage in terms of monogamy, etc., different numbers of sexual partners. Maybe we'll touch on cohabitation, etc. But it all begins with this idea of individualism, expressive individualism. Can you tell us what that is and why it's so interesting to you?
Right. Well, I have to say, expressive individualism is something that I've just become more aware of recently. It certainly wasn't linked to my my clinical interests. But I'm going to read a quote from you. A quote, and this is a quote from Lord of the Rings. The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, and now none now live. Remember it. Actually, the world is changing so rapidly that many of us can remember what the world was like, and many of us feel quite perplexed about what the world is like now. We really struggle to understand how people's understanding of what it means to be human, and of ourselves, and of our relationships, and of community, all of those things seem to change quite dramatically. And as I've been trying to think about that, I encountered this work on expressive individualism. I'm going to give a quick plug. This book by a chap called Carl Trueman, called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And he starts to explore something called expressive individualism. And basically it's something where it seeks to explain why we end up in a society now, which is, first of all, it's individualistic. In other words, it rejects the authority of the community. It's materialistic. It rejects any idea of the transcendent or any authority in the spiritual. And it's also iconoclastic, which means, frankly, it rejects the authority of institutions, even those like the government or church or education. And certainly when I read the book, it really helped me understand why we were now in a society where actually even having ordinary conversations about what it means to be human, about relationships, is a complete minefield. And often we don't even understand why we disagree with the people with whom we disagree. And basically, expressive individualism is about saying that all truth is as I define it. You might hear people talking about, well, this is my truth. So there's no such thing as objective truth. The idea that previous generations, and indeed, to be honest, most of the rest of the world, because it's very much a Western phenomena, not a worldwide phenomena, would still see the definition of ethics, the definition of what it means to be human, as coming from outside. Now, that might be philosophical. Often it might be religious. So as Christians, it might be the word of God. But that's where you get your authority from. That's where you understand, have a shared understanding what it means to be a person. But expressive individualism says, actually, we define the world from inside, rather than us responding to outside. Everything is from within us, and ethics is things that are right as we see them.
I mean, you made so many valid points there, Nick. One, of course, was that it's just a Western phenomenon, which is quite interesting because we see ourselves as the world, don't we? As individuals do, in fact. I am the world, really. But there's maybe 2 billion of people in what you'd call the West, and there's another maybe 5 billion who aren't, and whose overarching psychology might be very different to ours, and that's something worth noting, if you like.
I mean, and of course, many of those people actually are in that culture. So I've talked about expressive individualism, but of course, for many people with a strong religious belief, be it Christian or Muslim or Hindu, actually they will still have a sense of that there is something from beyond to which they owe some sort of allegiance, and which impacts on the way in which they see society. And actually, many people who come from outside the West are currently within our cultures. I was giving a talk at a church the other day trying to explain expressive individualism, which, as you know, is not an easy thing to explain from scratch. And a number of folk from Western Africa were there. And they were very entertained by my talk. They couldn't imagine why people in the West could be so stupid as to think that it would be a healthy way of living to reject the community and to reject God. And of course, one of the things that expressive individualism does, it doesn't just reject the supernatural and the sense of there being God. It actually rejects the whole idea of the authority of the community. It's all about me. And interestingly, in this church group, I asked them to think, well, what impact might that mean in society? And the first thing that was said is people will no longer accept election results. And I hadn't thought about that. But in fact, yes, if you think the only right thing is what you believe, and someone's elected, which isn't the person you voted for, then actually you just don't accept. You don't accept the idea that as a community you function together for the good of the whole. In fact, you reject that. And of course, we've seen very recently, both in the States and in the UK, people trying very hard to reject election results. Even that core bit of being a liberal democracy is pretty well under fire.
Yeah. Now, so I spoke to Carl Trueman about his excellent book, and one of the questions I didn't ask him, Nick, was this concept of, if you look behind some of these agendas of expressive individualism, the idea is to break apart things like families and things like nation and kind of homogenize everyone into individual characteristics or into identity groups, if you like, and separate them from the usual ways we identify ourselves with family or with country or with role or with other things like that, and break down those things and give new identities, etc. Now, you may well say, and I may well agree, that actually isn't a healthy, good thing for society. But neither do we want everyone to be sheep and only think as the crowd, as the other sheep do, and not depart from it. So where would you say is the boundary between excessive expressive individualism and not just being part of the crowd and being willing to think differently? Because it's almost that last thing is what we need to challenge the expressive individualism, which is leading to this group identity, which is doing us so much harm. So it's almost like a bit of the pain is actually the cure.
There's two great dystopian novels, I think, in the English language. One of them is Brave New World, and the other is 1984. And of course, in Brave New World, we see people's individuality and their intellectual capacity taken away by effectively the free availability of sex and recreational drugs. Well, there's a bit in our society that you can see going on with that. Of course, in 1984 seems a lot harsher, but there it's the removal of language. And so you get this idea, for those of you who read the novel, that actually every word is gradually cut out until language is simply an automatic thing that has no sense of being processed. And of course, we're seeing the near death of freedom of speech at the moment, where to even suggest that one's identity might be, you might have a responsibility in your identity to look at the wider community. I mean, let alone to look at what God might require, is to get yourself immediately cancelled So the kind of loss of free speech is I think, a real concern. So yes, I mean, going back to what you say, so where you've got someone who is genuinely liberal, in other words, prepared to tolerate other viewpoints, to listen to what people say and to weigh it up, that's clearly beneficial. But what we're seeing now has moved beyond, I think, any sense of liberalism to actually being a potentially quite draconian in its restriction of freedoms and of speech. And it is too complex. I have tried to do it on other occasions to map through the kind of way in which Marxism and Freud have been fused to form the kind of the idea of a kind of critical analysis of the new left, which does seek to fragment society in order to obtain power. But nevertheless, that is what we are seeing, as gradually institutions are crushed and broken down. From a Christian perspective, one might have the idea of common grace, that God has given us institutions like government, like education, that have value. And marriage, of course, is one of the most important of those, I think, things that we're given to provide stability in society, to limit the impact of evil and to work for the good of humanity. But all of those potentially are being broken down by expressive individualism.
Yeah, it's like the theory that extreme left and extreme right meet around the back. Because it's almost so if you take the Engels idea, right, that we must liberate women from marriage, that marriage is oppressive, patriarchal trap for women, we've got to liberate them, and you take that through to the end of his writings, which is that women between the age of 17 and 34 must have babies with whoever the state tells them to, and those babies will be taken from them and reared by the state. That's the other end of the start of we must liberate women from marriage, and it's not pretty. And we're almost getting the same thing in our society today. So a liberal democracy, the old classical liberalism as it used to be the case, everyone would say great idea maybe, but the idea is that as it becomes more and more liberal for smaller and smaller groups, in order for those groups to have their liberal truth lived out, the rest of people have to ignore the evidence of their eyes and ears. And suddenly liberalism flips into tyranny overnight, and you wonder what happened.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point.
From my point of view, that moves into, because we would say actually having a man-woman lifelong monogamous marriage is the best way to bring about the best version of the next generation. It from an evidence point of view, from a secular evidence point of view, kids grow up better educationally, better mental health, better physical health, better propensity to earn, better adjusted in society, less propensity to get involved in the criminal justice system, less likely for girls to become pregnant in their teens, so many things. And of course, they carry those customs on from family to family. It's better for adults, it's better for women, it's better for men. Even people like Louise Perrier coming out and saying the best thing a woman can do is to find a husband, get married and stay married. So I think that's clear. But one thing which I still think we're really struggling with as a society is this idea of sexual chastity before marriage and then sexual monogamy after marriage. Tell us a little bit about the psychology, the mental aspects of why sex is so important. And those of us who do say it should be linked into this thing, marriage, why we're saying that, and if there's any science behind it.
So first I say I'm not an expert on the neurochemistry of sex, but there is no doubt that there's research that suggests that the actual having sexual intercourse, that having orgasm, that changes your hormonal state, and it does allow for more permanent bonding. So that when you have sex with someone, that develops and builds and strengthens your relationship. Now, of course, if you're then having that with lots of different people, it's a bit like if you take Velcro and the Velcro links you together. But if you keep taking it apart and you keep doing that long enough, then gradually the Velcro loses its ability to do that. So there is evidence that the more sexual partners you have before you get married, then the more difficult it is for you to stay married. And there's quite a lot of evidence that says optimally, the person, if you've only had sex with the person you marry, then that means that your marriage is more likely to survive with all the benefits you outlined. Because as you rightly say, particularly for children, the stability of marriage is crucial. And we know that divorce is associated with increased depression and anxiety in children. And indeed, actually, adultery leading to divorce is associated with increased depression and anxiety in the couple as well. It's something that really does have a significant impact on mental health. And there's the other thing that's quite interesting is that if you commit to marry, particularly if you marry before you start having children, then you're much more likely to stay married with all the benefits that gives both to you and to your family, and indeed modeling for the next generation.
And I get, Nick, whatever you say, somebody will say, well, actually, I grew up in a great environment and I'm fine and my brothers and sisters are fine and my parents weren't married. There are always going to be trends on both, or examples on both sides that buck the trend, but on a population base. And that's, if you're looking at things like government policy, if you're looking at things like the media, what the media should promote, the idea is that we should try promoting the thing which brings about the most good for the largest amount of people, and not ignore that and diminish that, which seems to me to be the case, which is what's happening more recently.
One of the downsides, I think, of expressive individualism is it completely undermines science. It completely undermines the idea that you would take evidence and build that into public policy. So let's be clear, there are plenty of people who have had brilliant upbringings by courageous single-parent mothers or single-parent fathers who've done a wonderful job and they have thrived. So what we're looking for is not to in any way say that those people cannot do a wondrous job. What we are saying, though, is that when you look at the research on a population basis, that these are the things that bring about the most stable and the best functioning society. But if always people are going to ignore scientific evidence, are going to ignore research evidence and say, well, actually, I feel in my heart this is the right thing for me to do. Well, one of the difficulties is it's very difficult to begin to have that kind of dialogue or ethical discussion. There's a very interesting, I think, ethicist called Alasdair MacIntyre, who talks about the fact that if you're going to have any kind of ethical discussion, you have to have what's called a shared teleology. And that means a shared understanding of the purpose of what you're talking about. So do we have a shared understanding of the purpose of human beings? If we don't have a shared understanding, then actually it's really difficult to begin to have that discussion. So, think about adultery and infidelity of marriage. If you have a shared understanding of human beings, and it's perhaps a Judeo-Christian understanding, and that marriage is something that's ordained by God. So it's about two people, man and woman, but it's also about their relationship with God. That's very different from an expressive individualist idea, which is I just do what makes me feel best at this time. Now, clearly, the latter is very difficult to build a stable relationship, because most of us who are married know that there are good times and there are less good times during marriage. And that sense of stability given to us by a shared community and a shared understanding of marriage within that community is enormously beneficial in helping us get through the more difficult times and finding that, yes, actually, this marriage is really worthwhile and was well worth fighting for.
That's absolutely right. And that, the idea of long-term marriage, much like a garden, the more work you put in, the beautiful it is, or the more beautiful it becomes over time. But it does, you're absolutely right, Nick. It does require a lot of work. And sometimes the sun is shining and sometimes the rain and the thunder is there too. But actually, You just got to get through that, recognizing that it's not just about how you feel today. That's not what marriage is about, which is why redefining marriage, just an adjunct, to make marriage not about sex or commitment, but about who likes who, just completely undermines the whole purpose of the thing. And adding to that things like no-fault divorce, well, you can just split up for any reason. In fact, you don't need a reason. Just completely takes away from the idea of this long-term marriage thing. Nick, I want to move on to look at, because I know you're a busy guy, but the idea of what we're teaching children in schools and the kind of psychological aspect of that, because we interviewed Professor David Payton, industrial economist, Nottingham University. He was quite clear that the more you teach kids about sex, the more sex they will have. And the more you teach them about different types of sex, the more different types of sex they will have. And yet we seem to be teaching kids stuff in schools these days which you cannot broadcast before 9 p.m. And I'm just wondering, from a psychiatrist's point of view, what is your take on all that?
In terms of access to, I'm going to slightly change it, because not only are kids getting a lot of fairly explicit but somewhat non-relationship based sexual education at school, of course, they're also getting that from absolutely easy access to pornography.
Absolutely right.
And frankly, neither of those things are going to help them get stable relationships in the future. We need to, I think, be teaching people first and foremost about relationships and about the mutuality of that, about the importance of commitment, and how all of those things long term will make your life much happier, and actually will create the environment in which you can thrive as a human being. Moving straight to the various ways in which you can express sex biologically without talking about relationship, without talking about respect, and without love seems extremely short-sighted. But I think probably even more harm is done by the easy access to pornography, which is something which is really, I think, impacted on society. One of the things we perhaps don't realize is that it's relatively recent that society has been almost 100% about sex.
Yes.
Freud's got a bit of responsibility to take on this. He made sex something that was about the whole of the human lifespan, not just about being adult. He thought very much about the sexuality of children, but he also it's entered, I think, the society's consciousness or belief, the idea that almost the ultimate happiness, the ultimate sense of meaning, is to be in a sexual relationship, and that's relatively new. And of course, one of the things that reinforces that has been what we would call the pornification of society and its free availability.
Yeah, and I think so. If you look at, I've often spoken about TikTok, and I don't know how many parents watching have actually sat down and used TikTok for 3 hours straight, which is what your kids do every single day. And if you did that once, I think you would probably not let them use TikTok ever again, because the amount of soft porn which just permeates every aspect of it is just ridiculous. And you're right, the kids are being exposed to sorts of stuff. And even I was at a thing recently, and I'm not sure of the background to this data, but somebody was saying that a third of porn these days is consumed by girls. And they're consuming it to see what's expected of them. And it just breaks your heart to think of, young children looking at it and thinking, well, this is no wonder they're thinking, I don't want to be a girl if that's what I've got to do. It's absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah, no, I think that is really really true. I mean, we look at the things that pornography does, which are damaging. I mean, first of all, it gives a very unrealistic view of what sex is like. Very often, there's no sense of there being any mutual respect or mutual pleasure. There's often a degree of violence. Women are expected to be dominated in a way that's often demeaning. So all of those things, I think, are difficult. I mean, one's really concerned about the way pornography is made, and there's the people who I think are often being exploited in its production. But we have to ask what it does to people, because if people are consuming pornography and that's how they are having much of their sexual activity, then you're taking it away from the whole context of relationship. And it's being moved, instead of it becoming a really valuable part of maintaining a stable monogamous relationship, it becomes something which is simply about the individual. There's no mutuality to it.
Yeah, no, on the subject of porn, and I know we've got viewers from all faiths and none, Nick, but I want to think about because I think it applies to everyone, the kind of Christian idea taken forward in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, where Jesus talks about the fact that you can sin in your head. Now, Jewish customs is more generally about physical sins, things you do, but Jesus moved that into actually, no. If you have lust for a woman in your head, you've already committed adultery. And I want to explore that a little bit, because I suppose, technically speaking, the situational placement of flesh geographically co-located with somebody else's flesh is one thing, but that's very, very different to what's going on in your mind when you commit adultery, when you have sex with somebody, but also when you're watching porn. And I think, because a lot of people are of the opinion, well, I'm not really doing anything, am I? I'm just looking at it. And yes, you've got the idea, well, yeah, but you're manipulating those people who feel they have to go into the porn industry. These days, I think with OnlyFans and all sort of stuff, people are clearly doing it for their own, on their own volition, to make lots and lots of money and not worrying about it at all. But the thing that's happening in your mind, a lot of people think that's because I'm not doing it physically, I'm not really committing adultery. What would you say about that?
I mean, first of all, as you rightly say, Jesus makes it clear that in all areas of sinfulness, and including areas of sexual sinfulness, that it's not just the doing, but it's the thinking. And clearly, in terms of people looking at pornography, they are having a sexual experience stimulated by someone who's not their marriage partner. It, of course, has potential significant impact, with many wives, or indeed husbands, who would find their partner using pornography would regard themselves as having been betrayed, and would see it like adultery, that someone's having sex, as it were, not with them, but with somebody else. So I think that's quite significant. The third thing, of course, is that it's at least got the potential, I think, to move you from the place of a stable relationship to make adultery more likely, because as you are experiencing sexual excitement in a range of other situations, then the monogamous relationship begins to become broken down. You can also argue that if you're using it to escape the fact that perhaps, and let's be honest, some people have different views of how much sex they want in a marriage. People have may even have sexual difficulties in a marriage. If you use pornography to escape that, then of course you're never going to make that relationship better. And as a result of that, being able to get things better, you again undermine the relationship. So there's a whole range of things. It's not just one thing. There's a complex range of reasons why, starting with, from a Christian perspective at least, that Jesus says it's wrong. But you can see why he says it's wrong, because there's all these other things which undermine a marriage. And just one final thing, you may not want to get into this, but it was for quite a few people who use pornography, it then becomes an addiction.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of evidence that if you use a lot of pornography, you rewire your brain. And as you rewire your brain, it becomes more and more difficult to have sex with a human being, as it were, rather than with a machine.
And I think that is the key point as well. I mean, I'm I'm reminded by a line, just wondering whether to say it or not. Reminded by a line in a book I read by John Ortberg, about kind of sex in marriage, and he was saying, he wanted sex in the morning, she wanted sex in June, and it was like, how would you marry those two things together? But those are conversations couples need to have. That's one thing. But then the idea that men, particularly, and I know this isn't across the board, but generally speaking, statistically, men are more visually stimulated, if you like. And so, porn does work an awful lot for men where it might not work for women who actually want something akin to a relationship, not necessarily just the visual, which is why, outside of marriage, physically outside, there's the two things, looking after needs within a marriage and having that discussion and reaching a compromise, but also outside the marriage, not putting yourself into situations of temptation. That's a terrible challenge because men are so visually driven. That's a particular thing for men. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong there, but it seems to me to be the case.
But I think it's right from a statistic point of view, but I think there's a lot of, one of the things is for a lot of these characteristics is you can find a lot of people of both sexes for whom it is an issue. But the fact that we need to actively defend our marriages, both by ensuring we have good communication, that if it's a difficult topic, we find a way of having that discussion. If it's a real problem, we may even need to involve somebody else. So
absolutely.
A marriage counselor at church or somewhere like Relate or some kind of organization that will help us to have a really difficult conversation. But then we also need to take responsibility, which means we need to be able to, and this is one of the other dangers of expressive individualism, it's all about the here and now. We have to be able to look to the future and recognize that value we have in a relationship, not just for days and weeks and months, but for decades. And be prepared to take responsibility not to put ourselves in situations which we know we will find tempting. And that's a responsibility we have to take.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I don't think, there's no stigma associated with saying, well, actually, look, we care about our marriage and we want to make it work and we're not sure what the solution is here. So we wouldn't mind getting a third party's advice. Find someone you trust, find somebody who cares about you. Absolutely no problem with doing that. I think it's a really healthy thing to do. You do it with every other aspect of life. You do it with your garden, you do it with your car. You think, well, actually, I need some advice because I don't really know what to do to get this working properly, but I want to make it work properly. And the good thing is making it work properly. The other thing you mentioned was the addiction factor and how porn can be so addictive. And again, that again belies the power of sex, because the idea of sex with one person is that you become addicted to them. It ties you to that one person in a really strong way, which is a good, strong, healthy thing. It's good for kids. It's good for the two of you. From a societal point of view, it makes sure that all kids are looked after. It makes sure that people know who their kids are. You just haven't got random kids all over the place that nobody knows who the fathers of, etc., etc. Women, I don't know. It just statistically it makes perfect sense. And that addiction fact, if it's attributed properly to one person, is actually a real strength, not a weakness of sex.
Now, I might just push back about the idea of addiction. I think what you're talking about is the benefit of sex in clearly bonding two people together. Yes. And it binds them together. And that is a really important thing to do. I guess the problems with addiction, and why I perhaps just push back a little on that, is addictions tend to grow and grow until everything else is pushed out.
Okay.
And so one of the issues with people who become addicted with pornography is not only does it rewire their brains, so they require more and more extreme pornography in order to get sexually stimulated. And, there's reports of even young men in their early 20s requiring Viagra to have a sexual relationship with their partner, because actually they have been so rewired through pornography. But actually, sexual addiction to pornography can ruin your life in other ways. I mean, when I was medical director of a large mental health organization, and I can remember being involved with disciplinary cases with people who have got so addicted to pornography that they couldn't even wait to get home to start viewing it, and that, of course, can be extremely difficult.
So how do you help them? What's so if somebody's listening now, right, and you can bet your bottom dollar there is somebody listening who thinks, yeah, I watch porn secretly, nobody knows, I watch a lot of it, and I can't stop. What's your advice? How would you help them?
I mean, the first level for anyone who's watching pornography realizes it's wrong and wants to stop. I think even before we get to an addiction level, is you've got to take a decision that you realize it's wrong. You're not going to do it. Now, that, of course, is difficult because it's so easily available. Frankly, when you and I were lads, it was a much more difficult thing to get hold of. And now it's in your pocket in the phone. It's everywhere. But if you've decided that, then one of the things I think is always useful, and frankly, I think it's useful for us in many issues of our life, is to have an accountability relationship. Have someone who is a responsible friend, someone with whom one can be honest. As a Christian, for me, it's having a prayer partner with whom I can be completely honest about things. And so the first thing is to have someone with whom you can be completely honest and say, look, this is a problem for me. I want to stop. I'd like you to hold me accountable. I'd like to know you're going to ask me every whatever period it is whether I've been successful in not doing that. That's a kind of first level, but I think it's a very useful first level in terms of being held into account. As part of that, you can get if you want to make your accountability more significant, there's various things you can get for your computer which mirror your search history to your accountability partner. So not only can they ask you, but they can actually see what you've been looking at. That's quite a powerful way of I think of holding yourself to account. Now, clearly, for people for whom it's actually become a significant addiction, then at that point you may well need to seek help. I think actually Relate do run some specialist courses on this, or you may need to seek help from psychological services, as you would with any other addiction. But that would be the kind of tiered approach I would be thinking.
So you'd go to a GP, would you, or what would you recommend?
I think you could go to a GP. I think, but probably what your GP would be doing would be referring you to some kind of psychological service. If you've got the resources to do it, to be honest, you might well be better actually. As I say, if you get to the point where it's a real problem, where catastrophe is imminent, therefore you've got to get urgent help. You might well. There's plenty of places you can go on, and actually, private psychological help is relatively easy to get hold of. So you can actually you can go online and you can find some. You could relatively quickly access it if you're willing to pay for that in the short term. As I say, Relate run courses on this. So there's a range of options. I'm well aware of how swamped mental health services are at the moment. So my concern is you go to your GP, it might be quite a long time before you got the help you needed. So you might want to try some of the other routes.
And it does, I'm aware of a couple who have their marriages ended because of pornography, and you just think, what a sad, sorry disaster.
Well, I think there's a range of studies around that show quite a lot of marriages end. But it's quite difficult sometimes to know whether it's a cause or a symptom. But I think quite often it can be the cause. And I think quite often, because it involves secrecy, it involves a shame, involves hiding. And so I think once you get into the habit of starting to do stuff which you're hiding from the other person, that's not a good way of building a trust, open, honest marriage, is it? And it shuts down communication rather than opening it up. So it's not going to help. So a marriage that's in difficulty will be put into more difficulty by people getting more into porn.
And it is a form of adultery, of course it is, and which is why it's so damaging. I listened to a thing the other day, Jordan Peterson was talking about why adultery is so bad, and he was saying that for a woman it's not just the fact that you did something and you broke trust, but but that the person she thought you were, the person she thought she was, the life she thought she had constructed, her reality all around her is just a fake. It's not there anymore. You know, the life she thought she was living was a fraud. How long has this been going on? You know, the trust she thought she had, if it was the male obviously doing it, you know, and that her whole life becomes deconstructed by this thing which took place. And how terrible an emotional impact that is for a marital partner is very, very significant.
Yes. And that's why adultery is often associated with quite high levels of depression and anxiety. Actually, in both partners, it's something which is extremely damaging, because you do have a model of the world that you've built, and as you rightly say, it shatters it. So you can rebuild that. So there is if you put if there's a willingness to turn away from the adultery and to seek help to do that, it's possible to begin to rebuild that. But you've still damaged something which is really precious, and it's very difficult to rebuild that.
And that's why the alternative is so much better. And again, that's why it makes, you know, the idea of premarital sexual partners, anything above 0 increases the likelihood of divorce, because A, it increases the likelihood of it happening again, and B, you don't have that unique, significant bond. Now, I just want to finish on a positive, because there'll be a lot of people in society, inside and outside Christian circles, because I'm afraid the stats don't seem to change when you walk inside a church. They seem to be reflective of the wider culture. But a lot of people who have maybe made mistakes in their life, you know, they've lived a life before, you know, as teens or something, which they're kind of regretting now. Is there hope? I mean, how do we think, I want a happy marriage, I want a happy monogamous marriage, a long-term thing, which again, the stats say most people want, most teenagers want, they aspire to it, but they may have made a mistake, they may have got things wrong. How do we repair that stuff?
Well, I think I guess, first of all, and here I'm speaking as a Christian, that we know that we have a gracious God. He tells us that our sins can be put as far as the east is from the west, and I think it is possible for people to repent of what they've done, to realize it's wrong, and to come afresh to marriage. What I would say is, even then, you probably need more support. But one of the good things that being a Christian means, and to be fair, a number of other faith groups would be the same, is that you can get a lot of support, but you might well actively recognize that you need that support. People often drift into marriage and they don't really understand the full implications. I used to do assessments sometimes. My particular area in psychiatry, one of my specialist interests is people with learning disabilities, and I used to do assessments as to whether people had capacity to marry. And the capacity what you needed to understand to marry was relatively low. But I remember talking to a young man who people thought he didn't have the capacity. And he explained to me how it would be his responsibility to put his new wife first, and that he should be working for her happiness. Now, this was a young man with a learning disability, but I have to say, if more people went into marriage recognizing that actually the responsibility is to do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility value the other above yourself, look to the other person's interest first, and recognize there will be difficult times, but if you're putting the other person first, and they're seeking to do the same, then you will get through those difficult times. So I think we have, both in the social support through church, but also in that perspective of marriage where we put one another first. Jesus says that we should, as husbands, we should love our wives as Christ loved the church. That's a fairly high standard, but actually it also helps realize that the nature of that exclusivity, and the fact that that's something we need to actively take on board, as opposed to drifting into a relationship which is not thought through.
I love that thought that you mentioned, for Christians, but also for non-Christians, that idea of repentance. You know, that you're honest with somebody and you say, I regret, I repent, I'm sorry I did it. And you know, I want you're my permanent partner now, you know. And there's nothing like repentance to provoke forgiveness. You know, it's a wonderful thing if it's there, and that's the great thing. And then you also alluded to the fact that, and again, it may be a generalization, but I think it's a good one, that women want to know that they're going to be loved and protected as the most precious thing in his life, you know, and he wants to know that she's going to respect him for doing that, and that the one thing actually leads to the other. And yeah, people are going to say that's terribly, you know, misogynistic, whatever. But in real life, I think that's the way it goes. Women want to be loved and protected as the most important thing, and men want to feel respected for having done that. And those two things, you know, I don't think there's an awful lot which will damage a marriage which has got those two things. Nick, it's a real privilege to talk to you. You're an absolute towering intellect, and your experience and knowledge around these issues, I think, is so valid and so credible in a world which just doesn't rely on data, doesn't rely on common sense. It's so refreshing to talk to somebody who does. Dr. Nick Land, thank you very much for your time.
Cheers, Tony.
All right, take care. Speak soon.
Bye.